The Eurasian steppe is one of the most important regions in world history. At its western end, on the Pontic Caspian steppe, after about 5000 BC, the hunter-gatherers of the fertile river valleys gradually adopted some of the technologies of the Neolithic farmers who had moved into Eastern Europe and the Caucasus. These hunter-gatherers began herding sheep and cattle, which radically transformed their ways of life, and they became enormously successful. One of their descendant groups was the world-famous Yamnaya culture. By the early Bronze Age, some of these highly vigorous steppe herders expanded from their homelands into new regions, a process that brought their ways of life and Indo-European languages and beliefs to almost every part of Europe, and into Siberia, China, the Near East, Iran and India, and eventually even beyond. In the Iron Age, Iranian-speaking Scythians and Sarmatians would dominate the western steppes, and then a series of famous groups like the Ostrogoths, Huns, Turkic peoples and the Mongols would inhabit or sweep across the land one after the other from late antiquity to the medieval period, until Slavic peoples came to dominate until today. But what happened on the Pontic steppe between the late Neolithic, early Bronze Age Yamnaya culture and the Iron Age Scythians? Well, for about 500 years, between 2500 BC and 2000 BC, there was a vibrant society thriving here. They're incredibly interesting, not just because of who came before and after them, and because of how they influenced and were influenced by the societies living beyond their borders, but they're also a fascinating society in their own right. These people made great use of the ox-drawn wagon to exploit the immense grasslands of the open steppe. Their covered wagons were critical, cutting-edge technology that enabled their way of life as herders of sheep and cattle as they moved their herds to different pastures through the year, bringing their food, water and shelter with them. Unlike their Yamnaya culture ancestors, however, they were not entirely mobile. They also founded settlements in certain areas, where they lived in houses with stone foundations, and they even built fortresses. They developed new burial customs for special people in their society who were buried beneath huge mounds of earth known as barrows or kurgans, burial mounds which made a statement on the landscape forever. Their graves were cut into the ground, with side chambers for the grave goods that were buried along with the people. These incredible graves, and the goods inside, helped to inform us about how they lived and what was important to them. Their graves also often contained special ceramic bowls that archaeologists believe were used to hold cannabis seeds that were burned in sacred, mind-altering rituals, facilitating the journey of the spirit into the afterlife. The burial rites of the most special people, great steppe chieftains, could be spectacular events with hundreds or even thousands of attendees, featuring grand funeral feasts consuming vast quantities of cattle and horse meat. They also drove horse-drawn chariots at the same time as the Sintashta culture far to the east. In fact, this is one reason why some people believe this society was ancestral to the Indo-Iranian speaking cultures of the later steppe. They also practiced artificial skull deformation. Children had their heads bound in certain ways as they grew, so they would develop strange skull shapes in adulthood. But where did this culture come from? What language might they have spoken? Is it possible that they are the ancestors of the Greek-speaking Mycenaeans? What relationship did they have to the Indo-Iranian speaking people of the steppes that came after them? And what ultimately happened to them? This is the amazing story of life on the western steppes during the Middle Bronze Age and the people of the Catacomb culture. Here on the Pontic Caspian steppe, thousands of years ago, there was a revolution in the way people lived. They had lived in the small settlements in the many river valleys, herding sheep and cattle on the lush floodplains and fishing the rivers. But after about 3500 BC, their way of life changed. They began using ox-drawn wagons, a technology invented in Neolithic northern Europe, to move out of the valleys and onto the endless grasslands of the open steppe. These wagons enabled people for the first time to utilise enormous areas of virgin land for grazing their herds. The wagons meant people could bring stored water out onto the dry steppes, and they could bring shelter and fuel with them. The covered wagons themselves could be shelter, but also they could carry tents to erect in summer pastures. They developed other technologies like metalworking, mining copper from sources on the steppes to turn into tools and weapons. We know about these people mainly because of the new burial practices they developed as they spread out across the landscape. They buried people in pits dug into the ground, along with grave goods like ceramics, personal ornaments often made from bone, and precious copper objects. They also contained reed mats, textiles, leather, and even furs, and possibly even felt and carpets, covering the pit walls and floors, or laid outside the grave pits. These materials were often decorated with patterns in 2 or more colours. Most of the excavations were carried out long ago, and there's few photos or preservation of these delicate, ancient organic materials. Sometimes there are fireplaces or hearths in or beside graves, which may be related to funerary rites or reflect the idea of the grave and the mound as a kind of eternal home requiring a fire. Over these burials, they raised huge mounds of earth called kurgans or barrows. These burials were excavated by Russian archaeologists over 100 years ago, and the culture they defined was named after the pits the people were buried in. They were called the Yamnaya culture, and they've become famous because of their enormous success. You might have seen news articles about them in the mainstream media, sometimes calling them things like the most violent people who ever lived. This is because after around 3000 BC, steppe herders expanded from their original homelands westwards out of the steppe, and over multiple generations, their descendants reached most of Europe. This was mostly men doing the moving, but it was women as well. They brought Indo-European languages and beliefs with them, changing Europe forever. But it was not the Yamnaya culture doing this exactly. The Yamnaya culture is the name for the archaeological culture found on the Pontic Caspian steppe and the lower Danube. The Indo-European speaking people of Central and Northern Europe developed new burial customs, technologies and art styles that archaeologists called the corded ware culture. Their descendants would later develop or adopt the bell beaker culture in the west of Europe, while in the east, descendants of the corded ware culture would expand across the forest steppe ecological zone to the Ural Mountains and beyond. While in the steppe itself, the Yamnaya culture of the early Bronze Age would come to be replaced by a new descendant culture called the Catacomb culture. By the way, in England we pronounce it catacomb, rhyming with tomb. In America they say catacomb. The earliest evidence for the particular collection of burial customs and artifacts that archaeologists define as the Catacomb culture emerged in the region between the Don River and the Kuban River north of the Caucasus. I've seen various dates given for the earliest Catacomb culture graves from 2800 BC to 2500 BC. This culture then spread throughout much of the Pontic Steppe to replace that of the Yamnaya culture. But the Catacomb culture would never be as widespread as the Yamnaya had been, although some archaeologists think they reached as far as modern Moldova and eastern Romania at least. This era, around 2500 BC, was around the time that the Proto-Indo-European language stopped being spoken and the various daughter languages had diverged. It's possible that the Catacomb people spoke an Indo-European language ancestral to both Greek and Armenian. I'll come back to this later. That the Catacomb culture descended from the Yamnaya culture was long suspected due to the similarities in burial customs. Russian archaeologists in the late 19th and early 20th century, excavating the burial mounds in the steppes, found that the deepest, and therefore the earliest, of the graves were the simplest. These early Bronze Age graves they called the pit grave or Yamnaya culture. Those above them, and therefore later, and Middle Bronze Age, often had an additional burial niche excavators called a catacomb, and so were named the Catacomb or Catacomb-Naya culture. And above them were more complex burials lined with wood, the Late Bronze Age timber grave or Shrubnaya culture. These early physical anthropologists discovered that the people of the Catacomb culture were even more heavily built than those of the Yamnaya culture beneath them, but they seemed to be of the same broad physical type. This relationship between the Yamnaya and the Catacomb cultures has now been confirmed thanks to genetic testing of ancient genomes. We can see, for example, that the male lineages of the Yamnaya culture, most commonly the one known as R1b, continues to be the most common one seen in the Catacomb culture. The Y haplogroup is passed on exclusively through father to son, and so is invaluable in tracing migrations and lineages through time. They also tested the mitochondrial haplogroups, passed on by mothers to their children, and the Catacomb culture people carried mostly haplogroup U, which is a very ancient and very common European maternal haplogroup. So the haplogroup data and whole genome analysis shows that the people of the Catacomb culture were descended from the Yamnaya culture people. Catacomb culture graves were burial pits augmented with another burial niche that contained grave goods. Bodies were usually placed in the grave in a flexed position lying on their right side and were accompanied with a range of burial goods. These could be stone or metal axes, maces, arrows and daggers, and metal or bone ornaments. They also contained animal bones, including the heads and hooves of cattle, horses, sheep and goat, which were likely consumed during funeral feasts. In a catacomb grave near the Volga, dating to around 2500 BC, 40 horses were sacrificed for the funeral feast of an adult man. Above his grave were 40 horse skulls arranged in 2 rows. There were also 3 ram skulls on the floor of the grave. The meat of 40 horses would come to perhaps 8,000 kilos, enough to feed hundreds of people for days. Presumably, people came from miles around to join in the burial, to help in the erection of the mound, and to take part in the rites that went along with it. The funeral feast must have been an extraordinary event, and the man they honoured must have been a very special individual. We can only imagine what heroic feats he accomplished in his life to warrant such an honour. Catacomb ceramics were more sophisticated than those of the Yamnaya culture, with finer fabrics, forms and decoration. They also made these interesting censers, which are bowls with wavy feet. These objects are part of an older tradition, likely dating back to the Sredni Stog culture, and certainly by the time of the Yamnaya culture, of ceramic censers or braziers used in rituals involving the burning of sacred organic substances, such as cannabis seeds. It seems likely that the inhalation of cannabis was a process by which altered states of consciousness could be achieved. It facilitated a transition from the normal state of being into another. This may be why the censers are associated with burial rites, where the spirit of the deceased also must transition from the ordinary world to the afterlife. They also used another method to assist the journey to the next world. Wheeled vehicles are also found in some burials, and these tell us a lot about the catacomb society and their beliefs. Most of these vehicles were 4-wheeled, ox-drawn wagons, like those of the Yamnaya. Some had covers over the top to protect the interior from sun and rain. These covers were wooden poles, bent over and covered with woven matting or leather, and the floors of the wagon were also lined with matting. It's such a shame that so little of the original colours of these organic materials survive. We have to imagine the paints and dyes these people used to decorate the wooden surfaces of the vehicles, the patterns they wove into their dyed woolen fabrics and mats, the symbols and motifs they painted on the covers of their wagons, marking their tribal identities, and so on. These vehicles are so emblematic of the Bronze Age steppe, and imagining them trundling across the grasslands in their dozens, along with great herds of animals, is so evocative. This is how these people lived their lives. They also used them for long-range journeys, enabling trade with far-off regions. These vehicles were a necessary part of their lives. They just could not live without them. So it's easy to see why they also formed part of their burial ritual. Some graves are found with 1 or 2 vehicles inside, usually dismantled. Sometimes the 4 wheels will be in the corners of the grave pit, with the body lying on mats, as if the deceased is lying on the bed of the wagon, so their spirit can be carried into the afterlife by the spirit version of the wagon. They also made wagon models from ceramics. Other times the entire dismantled vehicle is in the catacomb section of the grave, as if ready to be reassembled for use in the afterlife. It's as though they couldn't even imagine an afterworld where you wouldn't need one. The motif of a journey to the afterlife by wheeled vehicle occurs in many later Indo-European cultures, not just from Iranian speakers of the Iron Age steppe, but also in other parts of Bronze and Iron Age Europe, among Celtic, Italic, and ancient Greek societies. They also developed two-wheeled vehicles, which some see as the precursor to the light war chariot pulled by horses that would emerge by 2000 BC. Chariots had to be as light as possible to be pulled by horses rather than oxen, and the invention of the spoked wheel was one of the necessary steps. Wagons up to this point had used tripartite solid disc wheels from their invention in Northern Europe 1,000 years earlier, and they continued to serve the catacomb wagons perfectly well. But the expert wheelwrights of the catacomb culture came up with a way of making wheels lighter while retaining their strength. These are called crossbar wheels. They're not as light as spoked wheels, but they are easier to make, and were so effective they continued to be used across the world here and there into the modern era. Evidence of the first spoked wheels in the world is seen in graves of the Sintashta culture east of the Urals after about 2000 BC or so. I've said many times on this channel that the Sintashta invented the war chariot, and that's probably true. However, they were developed out of earlier steppe technologies like two-wheeled wagons and innovations in wheel designs, as well as horse breeding. One of the ways archaeologists track the spread of chariot technology from the steppes across the world is by finding artifacts called disc-shaped cheek pieces. These are rounded objects with bumps on one side that were fitted to horse harnesses to press painfully into their cheeks when the reins were pulled. These were only used on chariot horses to make the horses respond quickly to steering commands, which was necessary for driving high-speed chariots. The first ones were made of bone and antler, but these forms continued to be made in bronze, as far away as ancient Egypt and China. Anywhere you find cheek pieces, you know they had chariots. And the most archaic design of disc-shaped cheek pieces, suggesting they are the earliest, are found in late catacomb culture contexts. Because very precise dating of these artifacts is difficult, the extent to which chariot technology was developed in the catacomb culture and in the contemporary Abishevo culture to their northeast, before being perfected in the Sintashta culture, is unclear. Perhaps Sintashta chariots instead spread quickly into the catacomb culture area, or perhaps chariot technology developed through interactions between the various steppe and forest steppe cultures of the Middle Bronze Age. Either way, the catacomb people were amongst the first in the world to use horse-drawn chariots, certainly by 2000 BC, and this was a technology that would change the world. So most catacomb people were rather mobile, and there is little evidence for settlements. Most of those that have been found are interpreted as short-term seasonal sites. But there are some more substantial settlements, however, including one by the southern Bug River, which had 3 large buildings with stone foundations. And on a small island in the Dnieper was built a late catacomb fortress from stone, protected by a surrounding ditch. I imagine this island fortress would have been rather difficult to attack. Like the steppe cultures before and after them, the catacomb culture practiced a degree of sporadic tribal warfare, likely focused on raiding. No doubt they mostly sought cattle and slaves. And although they overwhelmingly relied on herding animals, some groups did sometimes grow einkorn and emmer wheat at their settlements. And wooden ploughs have even been found in catacomb graves, suggesting this was an important occupation for some people. Most people in the society were never chosen for burial beneath a barrow, but still there are thousands of burials known. The Yamnaya culture often seemed to be the earliest people who arrived in an area, and they were the ones who erected the most barrows, clearly declaring their right of ownership of the land to neighbours, rivals and descendants. Catacomb culture people did also erect barrows, but fewer than the Yamnaya culture. However, most of the graves found within those barrows belonged to the later catacomb culture. They would often dig down into existing Yamnaya barrows to create their own graves. Secondary burials could also be accompanied by increasing the height of the barrow above the new grave. In one limited study of steppe burials, the Yamnaya accounted for 10% of the graves, while 45% were from the catacomb culture. 7% were from the later Late Bronze Age Yamnaya culture, 29% were Iron Age Scythian burials, and 9% were medieval. So, by one analysis, out of all the kurgan burials on the steppe for thousands of years, the Catacomb culture, which existed for about 500 years, made up almost half of them. Some archaeologists have attempted to extrapolate total population sizes from the numbers of burials and available resources in their region. One estimate puts the population at 50 to 60,000 catacomb people living in the Pontic Steppe at any one time, which suggests a low population density, but the many centuries of grazing these huge herds of animals had started to impact the environment. When burial mounds were erected over graves, the grassland beneath was sealed in beneath the earth piled on top of it. Archaeologists excavating catacomb-erected mounds have analysed the buried earth beneath and discovered signs of overgrazing in certain areas. It's possible that this may have encouraged catacomb tribes to strike out into new regions. There was also a global climatic shift in about 2200 BC, known as the 4.2 kiloyear event, causing widespread, prolonged drought in many areas. Surely this too drove some catacomb groups to look for new lands to graze. This, along with the deep cultural desire to explore and conquer. It's likely catacomb groups north of the Caucasus drove south into Armenia, bringing their Indo-European languages and culture with them, which would later develop into Armenian. While on the western end of the steppes, catacomb groups moved into the Balkans, and their descendants would eventually move into Greece, bringing languages which would become Greek. The link between the catacomb culture and the Mycenaeans of Greece has long been suspected due to the similarities in material culture. Some linguists believe that Greek and Armenian, and Phrygian and Albanian perhaps, share traits that suggest a common ancestor. Some also see close links with Indo-Iranian, which again suggests a link to the steppe. Archaeological similarities between the catacomb culture and the first Greeks are seen in the burial tradition expressed in the famous Mycenaean shaft graves, which are like more sophisticated versions of the earlier ones on the steppe. There are specific artifact types linking the two societies, sometimes through intermediate groups between the two. And they also used burial stela, the carving of funeral stelae, great slabs of stone often decorated with carvings of human figures, began on the steppe around 3300 BC, and at least 300 have been found in Yamnaya and catacomb graves in the North Pontic steppes, usually reused as grave pit covers. This tradition was continued as their descendants expanded beyond the Danube. Another suggested link is the catacomb culture practice of making clay masks of the deceased. This ritual process entailed filling the eye sockets, ears and mouth with clay, and to one degree or another, roughly modelling the features of the face in clay. There are over 100 examples known from the Dniester to the Donbass, which constitute about 3% of all excavated catacomb burials. Clay model faces are clearly associated with high-status burials, those accompanied by wheeled vehicles, axes and other prestige items. The clay masks were done mainly to men, but some women and children had it done too. And it's been suggested that this catacomb clay mask tradition may be the ancestor of the later gold masks of the shaft grave burials of the far wealthier Mycenaean rulers. As well as performing rituals on the skulls of the dead, they also manipulated the skulls of the living. In some regions of the catacomb culture, they practiced artificial skull deformation. This involved binding the heads of certain babies in specific ways, so that their skulls grew into deformed shapes. Now, this practice on the steppe actually dates back to the Yamnaya at least, but it was increasingly done by certain tribes of the catacomb culture. This is an extreme modification of the body, requiring long-term investment, and it must be done on young children as they grow. Why did they do this? It was likely done to mark certain people out as belonging to a specific ethnic group and social class, and perhaps to certain roles in the society. Head binding was such a powerful social practice that it continued on the steppe for thousands of years. The catacomb culture also practiced trepanation of the skull. that is, drilling or cutting holes into the skulls of living people for medical or spiritual reasons. One study found almost 10% of skulls examined had undergone trepanation. It's likely they also practiced tattooing, another long-term and widespread steppe custom. Clearly, modification of the body to emphasize social similarities and differences was important to these people. They had a complicated society expressed in personal ornamentation and physical aesthetics. So, how did they relate to the other contemporary cultures on the steppe and those that came after them? And what happened to these people? There is evidence the Catacomb culture used composite bows. Measuring 90 to 130 centimeters in length, these were constructed of segments of wood fitted together with lashings, gum and bone plates. They've also discovered remains of quivers containing 10 to 20 arrows that were between 45 to 60 centimeters long. These relatively small but powerful bows were famously used by later cultures from the Scythians to the Mongols because their small size was necessary for shooting from horseback. So does this mean the Catacomb people were horse riders? Well, perhaps, but it seems rather early for widespread horse riding and mounted archery, and considering these bows were also used by the chariot-driving Sintashta culture, I expect they were developed for shooting from chariots instead. But you can see why so many archaeologists in the past have seen the Catacomb culture as ancestors of the Indo-Iranian people of the later steppe. I think it's perhaps more complicated than that. The Catacomb culture was actually made up of smaller subgroups, each with its own particular ways of doing things. Each group traded with and warred with their neighbours. These various interactions meant different cultural, genetic and linguistic exchanges with those around them. For example, the characteristic Catacomb culture hammerhead clothing pin made from bone spread all the way across Europe, even being seen in Bell Beaker culture Britain. These were clearly special items. Some people think they were for pinning woolen cloaks. Wool was still a relatively new material in the early and middle Bronze Age, and so were a highly visible status symbol for the elites. And there are similarities between the Catacomb culture stone battle axes and those of the corded ware culture derived Vatyanovo culture of the forest steppe zone to their north. The stone battle axe was a weapon of old Europe, adopted by the corded ware culture as a weapon, tool and symbol of masculinity, which then spread to the Catacomb culture. And it looks like the corded ware burial position, contracted lying on the side, also influenced that of the Catacomb culture. The Abashevo culture emerged from the Vatyanovo culture as these corded ware derived people moved further eastwards, but they continued to be influenced by the steppe people to their south. Abashevo pottery was influenced by Catacomb culture ceramic traditions, in both decorative motifs and shell tempering technology. In metalwork too, some Abashevo knives copied Catacomb types. Incidentally, Catacomb metalworkers were so advanced that they even experimented with smelting iron. One Catacomb culture grave, dating to 2500 BC, had an iron knife blade with a bronze tang. This wasn't meteoric iron either, but forged iron. This was over 1,000 years before the start of the Iron Age, and long before iron was used by the civilizations of the Near East. They may not have kick-started their own Iron Age, but still this is really quite remarkable. So the Catacomb culture was influenced by neighbouring societies and influenced them in turn. It's likely gene flow also took place between these closely related populations. As I've said, some people spread into Armenia and the Balkans, but what about those that stayed on the steppe? Well, the Bronze Age steppe was a place of closely related ethnic groups that were in a constant state of competition with one another. New innovations were developed by certain groups that gave them advantages that meant they could grow at other groups' expense. Some developed new technologies and social practices that helped them to better respond to challenges like aridification, trade disruption or invasion. In this state of evolutionary selection, weaknesses from misfortune could be taken advantage of by those willing and able to do so. Let's take a step further back in time for a moment and put all this in a proper context. Proto-Indo-European was likely spoken by the Sredni Stog culture between about 4500 and 3500 BC. Some of the Sredni Stog elites, known as the Novodanilovka group, moved out of their homeland after about 4400 BC into the Lower Danube region and began to rule over the Chalcolithic cultures of Old Europe. Their descendants continued expanding over the generations along the Black Sea coast, eventually crossing into Anatolia, bringing the Anatolian branch of Indo-European with them. Back on the steppe, the Yamnaya culture emerged by about 3500 BC. Some people like to conceptualize the following Indo-European expansions into two main, sometimes competing branches. These two branches are evidenced through archaeology, linguistics, and genetics. There is the Yamnaya-derived, largely R1b male lineage groups of the steppes who expanded into the Balkans and the Caucasus. The Catacomb culture belongs to this branch. And there is the corded ware culture-derived, largely R1a male lineage groups who expanded into the rest of Europe, eventually developing Germanic and Italo-Celtic languages, and also spreading eastwards across the forest steppe zone north of the steppe. These eastern groups would eventually be speakers of Indo-Iranian languages. Now, this is a massive oversimplification, especially when it comes to the Middle and Late Bronze Age steppes, where there is ongoing interaction between these overarching cultural groups, if they even meaningfully exist in the first place. But in the Middle and Late Bronze Age, there was continuing contact between the steppe and the forest steppe groups. The R1b Yamnaya-derived steppe societies and the R1a corded ware-derived forest steppe societies influenced one another culturally, genetically, and linguistically. This may be why some linguists see links between the Greek and Indo-Iranian branches on the one hand, and also the Balto-Slavic and Indo-Iranian branches on the other. They diverged, but also influenced one another through the long centuries of contact on the Bronze Age steppes. So after about 2200 BC, new groups emerged in the Catacomb region, mainly a group known as the multi-cordoned ware culture, amongst many other names. Although closely related and continuing some of the catacomb lineages, they were different from the catacomb in their material culture, especially of course their diagnostic ceramics, and because they established many more permanent and fortified settlements. The 4.2 kiloyear event caused huge problems for many societies. It may have caused the collapse of the Old Kingdom in Egypt and the Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia, for example. And on the steppe, the aridification also led to changes and conflict. The catacomb culture goes into decline and the multi-cordoned ware culture expands from the Don to the Volga. And in the eastern part of the range, a group called the Lola culture expand from the Caucasus up through the Middle Volga region. And they were in a prolonged state of military conflict with the multi-cordoned ware culture. We know this from excavations of burials from both overarching culture groups. In some, they find the arrowheads that killed those men still inside the chest cavities, and the arrow types can be traced to their originating cultures. Other men had injuries to their skulls from being hit with battle axes. We know then there was conflict between different groups within the multi-cordoned ware successors to the catacomb culture, and between them and the intrusive Lola culture group, especially between 2200 and 2000 BC. For a time then, there were these catacomb and post-catacomb groups in competition with one another, probably existing in a checkerboard pattern across the steppes, with the catacomb culture gradually being pushed out, killed, and assimilated mainly by the multi-cordoned ware culture, but also by the Lola culture. It was surely a desperate time, with new warlords arising, creating alliances and succeeding or failing, with slaves and captives taken from rival and foreign groups. Ultimately though, after about 1900 BC, the late Bronze Age steppe would come to be dominated by the Shrubnaya or timber grave culture. They were genetically and culturally similar to the catacomb culture, but were also quite distinct and tended to carry the R1a Y haplogroup lineages. By now, the catacomb culture was no more, and the late Bronze Age Shrubnaya culture had taken over. And if you'd like to see a video about the Yamnaya, please hit like on this video and let me know in the comments below. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and as always the sources are listed in the description. Thank you very much indeed to my patrons and channel members. By supporting the channel, you get exclusive content and ad-free videos. The links to join us are in the description below. Now, please watch this video on the incredible Sintashta culture of the Eastern Steppes, the ancestors of the Indo-Iranian chariot warriors. Thank you for watching.